recently an awful lot about the Scottish constitutional situation and the recent bombshell which came out of Salvo last week about Scotland taking its case for self-determination and also for decolonisation to the United Nations. Now, I'm going to leave that topic today and focus in a little bit on something which is on everybody's minds, especially at this time of year, and especially since the UK government has announced another price rise in energy bills, which it is planning to introduce in April of this year. And that is a massive increase, a huge spike, much more than people expected, over 6% rise in the cost of fuel and power. Now, I thought it would be interesting to do a little comparison about these power prices and the rises that the United Kingdom has seen, and to try to explode the myth that's been put around by the United Kingdom and its mainstream media that this is a result of global price rises in open world energy markets. Now, that is a terrific excuse for not doing anything to keep domestic prices down. But it might interest you to know that United Kingdom energy bills over the last couple of years have actually increased by 210%. In fact, slightly more than that. 210% in the last couple of years alone. Now, if you compare that to the European Union's price rise that its customers have seen, the highest price rise in Europe that's been seen has been only 75% over the same time period. Now, that's a huge difference of 135%. Britain has the highest domestic energy costs of any nation at all in Europe, bar none. And the only explanation for why this is actually happening must be the way that that energy is produced and how it is paid for. Now, you'll probably be aware that many European countries' governments subsidise their energy production to make sure that the prices that people pay for their homes and businesses are kept in a manageable sort of level. And that's why the United Kingdom's prices have risen so much higher, because we don't have those protections. Our power, our gas is produced by commercial companies at full commercial rates as charged on the international open markets. That's not a lie, but there is no safeguard, there is nothing to actually keep those prices in check other than the price caps, which are allegedly to prevent prices rising higher than the UK government intends. And yet, every time we've seen an increase, it has been gigantic, and it's been sometimes twice what the market's actually expected to see. Now, because of that, the Scottish Government has, in its most recent budget, which just passed incidentally and is now becoming legislation, has just passed a segment of that, which will see the Scottish Government reinstate the recently cancelled winter fuel allowance for vulnerable people. Now, this is people on low incomes, people on fixed incomes, like our retired and elderly populations who can't afford their winter fuel bills, and who, because of their age or their infirmity, have to spend more on their heating than most of the rest of us who might be out working through the day and don't need to heat our homes. So the Scottish Government has actually now decided to mitigate this, despite the fact that the Labour Party did not support this budget, despite calling for the Scottish Government to actually do something to mitigate the cut, which the Labour government actually instituted in the first place. So we now have the Scottish Government, which is committed to reinstating the winter fuel allowance. Unfortunately, as far as I understand it, it's not going to happen in time for this winter fuel round of payments. So we're still going to be paying these massively high bills, certainly until next winter, when this new regime comes into play. Remember, the Scottish Government comes into force, the Scottish budget comes into force from April this year. Now, another thing which is interesting is how the energy in the United Kingdom is generated. And I looked at some statistics coming out of the energy industry recently, which show the various percentages of different types of energy production in both Scotland and in England. And what is interesting actually is that in Scotland, the vast bulk of our power is either produced by zero carbon means like offshore wind farms, tidal energy, solar, pumped hydro, and so on. But only 7.8% of Scotland's energy is produced by burning fossil fuels. So we're looking at a huge amount of energy generated by either low carbon or zero carbon means. Compared to England, England generates 41% of all its electricity by burning fossil fuels. So now we can perhaps see why it is that the UK government is so keen to siphon renewable energy from Scotland's offshore wind farms and other places directly into the English grid to reduce their reliance on incredibly expensive natural gas, which of course they pay for at full international market prices because of their own stupid policies. So it's beginning to look now as though the two countries are operating different systems. Scotland has a very strong commitment to coming out at zero carbon eventually. In other words, generating all its power, creating all its heating fuel from entirely renewable sources. And it's very close to doing that, with only 7.8% of our energy still being generated by burning fossil fuels, and that's mostly gas in our case, which is a relatively low carbon form of production. There's not much for Scotland still to do to reach net zero. In fact, it's probably going to hit that target well within this decade. Unfortunately, England is going the opposite way. Its population is increasing, not because of migrants who are illegal, but because of legal immigration and the fact that people keep having babies, and so England gets bigger and bigger in terms of its population. And because of that, it requires more and more energy to run its economy. And so it's got to get that from someplace, and we are the place that it's going to get that from. Now, as well as trying desperately to get itself weaned off fossil fuels, it's been revealed this week that BP, British Petroleum, has decided to stop its investment into renewables. It was being encouraged to do this by the British government until recently, but now that is being switched off, which, according to various pundits in the news recently, is, I think, a signal that BP is pivoting back towards more production of fossil fuels and not less. In other words, they're going to concentrate more on what their basic key product is, like petroleum spirits, oil, plastics, and methane and ethane, the gases which come out of petrol distillates. So the trend is very clear. Britain is heading back to the dark ages of fossil fuel production, whilst at the same time trying to offset that by basically pinching as much Scottish renewable energy as we can make, which we don't need to use for ourselves in the meantime. And of course, we have no control over where this energy is going, and we definitely do not benefit from it, because the profits from this are going directly to the energy companies who manufacture the energy, or rather extract it from the natural environment. So Scotland and England are going in very different directions here, as we've seen for many decades. But what's good about it is the fact that Scotland is very, very close now to being net zero, much closer actually than we are led to believe by the mainstream media, who seem to see net zero not as a target, but something inconvenient in Scotland that should just be ignored. But since we're almost there, what would be the point of stopping the switchover when we're so close to getting there? And with the extra energy production that we have available from our offshore wind energy, we can easily use that to manufacture hydrogen, so that we can pipe that to our homes to heat them. Now, if we use hydrogen, which is a product of electrolyzing water using renewable energy, which is almost free, then we can produce copious amounts of hydrogen, which is a clean burning non-carbon fuel, which produces tremendous amount of heat, can run through existing boilers with some adjustment, and produces only steam as a byproduct. That would mean Scotland would get to net zero well before anyone else, and be in a position to take advantage of that when it becomes independent, which I expect to happen fairly soon. Now, in closing this program today, and this is a slightly shorter show, I noticed there is something quoted in social media recently where Keir Starmer has allegedly, and I have not been able to verify this, but has allegedly said that if the SNP wins the next general election at Holyrood in 2026, that he would accept that as a mandate for Scotland holding another independence referendum. However, having said that, and having also said that it's not been verified, I haven't been able to verify this yet, we also know that the Labour Party makes all kinds of promises which it never intends to keep. But if it did, then that might mean there's going to be another independence referendum. And if we won that, then obviously that would be an indication of the will of the people. But as I've said many times before, a referendum given by the UK government would only ever be advisory. And that would mean that if it was a close won battle, say we got 52% or something like that in favour of leaving, the UK government would probably say, oh no, that's well within the margins of error in terms of the count, and would probably say no to it. And even if they didn't say no to it, it's Keir Starmer who's supposedly saying this. And what's in it for him, you know, if that happens? But it's the only place I've ever seen, or the only source I've ever seen, which claims that the Labour Party would indeed actually regard an SNP win in 2026 as a mandate for an independence referendum. And also, there's the definition of winning that that election in 2026. What is the definition of winning? Would it be getting the most votes or the most seats? Or would it be an outright majority in terms of winning enough seats in both votes for it to have an overall majority in Parliament? Now that was only ever been done once by Alex Salmond, and although it came close to being repeated in 2015, it didn't quite make it. That was in a British general election and not a Scottish one. However, if it were repeated, that would be a clear mandate that Scotland had abandoned all the unionist parties. And having won in that way, would Sir Keir Starmer still say no to an independence referendum? Well, maybe he would. But with the efforts of Salvo and Liberation Scotland at the moment progressing well, with the petition to the UN now being in the hands of an international non-governmental organisation, which basically is going to take that petition to the UN, not in Brussels, not in Europe, but actually in New York, and hand it over directly to the Director General of the United Nations, whoever that is at the time, in full view and in the glare of public scrutiny across the world's media. That would be a very, very embarrassing situation for the UK to be in. So it's interesting who will get there first. Will the SNP win the general election in 2026 before that happens? Or will Salvo's petition and Liberation Scotland's petition get before the UN before that election is won? Well, I don't know. I don't know how quickly this will happen, but it's interesting, and it certainly adds a little extra excitement to next year's general election. Anyway, that is it for me today. One final little piece of information that happened, a little piece of personal news, when I was contacted by yet another independence campaigner who was asking me how he could stand as an independent, pro-independence, candidate in the general election. And to be honest with you, I don't know what to say to this guy, but I do know that he is also a member of Salvo elsewhere. And if he is typical of the Salvo branches around Scotland, that there are a few of the members there who actually want to stand as independent candidates, then perhaps it's time that maybe Salvo, perhaps Liberation Scotland, looked at the idea of providing some kind of training for everyone who wants to do that, and for all the candidates to get together and agree a common manifesto that they can all stick to when they're interviewed about it, and also what they can say to voters in their constituencies and regions before they go to the polls. And remember, they will need election agents, they will need to provide the documentation, go through the vetting procedures, and also there will be costs involved in campaigning. So there would be a long way to go before we could do this. But it's an encouraging sign when people are actually volunteering to do it, and that maybe this is the first of a trickle, or perhaps a flood, of people who want to stand as independent candidates to basically not become politicians, but to get elected to Holyrood and to have a sizable chunk of that representation there to keep pressure on the SNP or other pro-independence parties who get elected to do the right thing. Anyway, it remains to be seen, but all the indicators at the moment are encouraging, and I think we have to keep not just the faith, but we have to keep optimistic that this may happen. And possibly for the first time, we might see a group of such candidates standing for election. And if a few of them win, well, that would be a major headache for the actual political parties, who would have to struggle to not quite compete, but to run alongside these other candidates. And if they are elected, to find some common ground. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you find today's programme interesting. The comparison between English and Scottish power systems, how it's produced, and why it's so expensive when people in Europe pay so much less. Now, people in Europe pay much less because most of their energy is subsidised by their governments, unlike the UK, which takes a hands-off approach and says, let them eat cake, let them pay the full price, let all of the energy customers in the UK feel the full force of international market forces. To me, that strikes me as basically just letting everybody suffer so that they don't have to deal with it. But it's time it was dealt with. And if we were independent, our government could choose to subsidise our energy industry, or even better, take it back into public ownership. That's it from Inde-Car today. I'll see you again soon. I'm sorry there's been a bit of a gap in these programs, but I'm trying to target these programs at individual topics, which I think people are most worried about. I'll see you soon. Bye bye for now.